So today, before we actually continue, every time that we do here at University of Canberra, I would always like to do the acknowledgement of the country. And the University of Canberra acknowledges the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which the university's main campus sites is located and sits, and believes that it is important as staff and as students recognize the importance of observing and recognizing Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians on this land at events being held at the university. And I would like to extend that to all other nations and all other peoples where you guys might be located. The event today is quite a selection of the different medley talks, if you would like. And when we are trying to find ways to feed ourselves in a safe, affordable, and nourishing environments, and especially without damaging the environment, is becoming even more urgent. And from the recent events that we have got of the global pandemic and food supply, it is becoming obvious that finding ways to solve growing food crisis and other complex environmental problems of our time is paramount. For this event, we also have got an author, Rod, and in his book, 10 Journeys on a Fragile Planet, Rod explores a different perspective and a personal insights into how a range of people and professionals confront the crisis. And in saying that, there's also a very strong parallel in a book with the researchers at University of Canberra and the Future of Food in the Canberra Region Network. And we're using this opportunity as a researchers at University of Canberra to actually show these interdisciplinary skills and to connect with the community via these type of events. Some of the housekeeping rules, please, as I said, keep your microphones on mute and the cameras turned off. And this will assist our presenters and attendees in keeping up with the stories in their presentations. Nevertheless, feel free to use a chat box to post your comments and the questions, and we will have the Q&A time allocated for the end of the session today. So for the first person to present, obviously we have got Rod Taylor, and Rod is a Canberra-based science writer. Rod's science columns have appeared in the Canberra Times newspaper and other publications for over 11 years. He has broadcast widely science shows and has appeared on the ABC local radio, Radio National, and the BBC. And aside from media, his other background is in IT and business systems. He has basically reported to me that he actually rides both unicycle and off-road motorcycle and has fallen off both of them. And I do have a tendency to believe him on that issue. So I'm just going to pass it over to Rod. Rod, the stage is yours. So just feel free to unmute yourself, my friend.
And yes, I have fallen off both unicycle and bicycle. In fact, I was riding the unicycle just to keep myself calm before we went live today. Now, I'm going to show you a little story, but thank you, Nanad, thank you, Sean, and thank you to my friends at the University of Canberra. This is a very special time for me. It's also a very sad time, and I would like to dedicate this event to my dear friend, Craig Jackson. Craig was a great friend and a great supporter. I really wish you could be with us today, Craig. Now, if just imagine that you want to do something like writing a book. So something like this is a very complicated exercise. I had to get 10 people, I had to get the stories and so on. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origin of the book and about how I did that. Because maybe you have a community event, or maybe you have a personal goal. Maybe you want to write a book. Maybe you have a research project, something you want to do. So telling the story, you'll get a sense of that. So I'm going to share my screen. And the first thing you'll see here is Anthony knocking. Anthony was a workmate of mine back in 2016, and I was an IT consultant and concurrently doing media. Anthony and I used to sneak off during work, and for a cup of coffee, we would talk to each other, share our thoughts about what was going on in our lives. And I had this real sense that I had to do something desperate. I always remember saying to Anthony, I don't want to be the old man in the nursing home saying I could have done this, I could have done that. And I said, I'm going to do something radical, but I didn't know what it was. And then only a few weeks later, I had kind of come up with this idea of writing a book. And I met up with another workmate, Josh, and we had a beer, and I said, I might write this book. And he's going, yeah, you should totally write this book. And he gave me all these ideas and people I could talk to. So where was it going to go next? How on earth was I going to do something as complicated as writing a book? Well, I'd already made friends with Jodie. Now, Jodie is one of these wonderfully well-connected people, and she was involved with Beyond Zero Emissions, and she would invite me to do bits of media for Beyond Zero Emissions. And through them, I met Mark Diesendorf, and Mark has given me an endorsement for the cover of the book you might have seen. He says this is an important book. That was pretty cool. And I met Andrew Blake as we did an interview on the radio, and Andrew became the first chapter on in the book. And also I met Bob Brown. I managed to grab an interview with Bob Brown one day at a protest rally. Now, Jodie also got me in touch with a local renewable energy group called Surrey, which has now changed its name, and they had a renewable energy day, and I met Simon Shake. And Simon came on the radio with me, and he was great. And I thought, Simon would be a really good story for the book. So there he was. And then in February 2017, there was a community energy congress going on in Melbourne. And it was just amazing. I'm not really big with big events, but I met all these people and they said, oh, you should meet this person, or you should meet that person, and so on. And they had this speed dating thing. And I met Heather Smith. Now, Heather is based in South Australia, and she's involved with Carina, a renewable energy group. And through Heather, I met Leonard Cohen and Monica, who's with us today, which is great, and Susan Jeans. And incidentally, my friend Craig, I stayed at his house with his partner Lizzie. They put me up at his place. Now, I also met Charlie Prell, and Charlie's been fantastic, a wonderful supporter, and Charlie was involved with the Renewable Energy Alliance. He was one of the people behind the Farmers for Climate Action and a renewables ag conference that I went to a few weeks ago, which was just fantastic. And also there was an open day at Hepburn Wind, and I was kind of wandering around looking gormless, and my friend Linda Wilson was there, and she spoke to Kate Orty, and Kate is with us today. And Linda grabbed me by the collar and said, here's Kate, you should talk to Kate. So Kate and I did some radio interviews, and I go, you know what, Kate should be in the book too. Now, I'm involved with a group called Sustainable Population Australia, and here's Jenny Goldie. And Jenny is a wonderful person, and she wrote the foreword for the book. Now, I write a column for the Canberra Times, which was Fairfax, is now Oz Community Media, and a reader sent me a question about hoverflies, and I got in contact through with Brian Lessard through the Science Media Centre, and I said, you should do an interview. You want to invite somebody? And there was Olympia, and Olympia became a chapter in the book, and Olympia is actually with us today, which is very, very cool. And because I do science communication, I'm involved with the Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, and there's Harko Schuck, and Inez is in Austria right now, and she has an amazing story, and she is one of the chapters. And Madeline, who's now a friend of mine, she gave me a huge amount of help with the book. Now, I'm going to stop it there, because I don't have time to go through this entire story, but can you see what's going on in this picture? This is a network of connected people. This is a community of sorts. And this is extremely significant right now because we're in a very dangerous time. We are entering danger. The only way we can avoid a bleak future is if we act collectively. And we are the last people in history who are able to do anything about it. And the lone hero myth is one of the most toxic ideas to infect our culture. If the Great Wars had gone another way, we would have muddled through somehow. But if we can't do something about the growing impact of humans on the planet, we are in serious trouble. So it's up to you, and it's up to me, and up to all of us to do something about it. So that's all from me, and thank you very much for your time today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers today.
Thanks very much for this, Rod. It is definitely, we do have one of the comments from the audience that you will be very good at contact tracing, and it would be absolutely fantastic to have you. And it's a very interesting to see the amount of connectiveness and the amount of how does the idea actually develop from the perspective of talking to one person and moving from one aspect to another and combining it all into this great book that you have actually managed to release, and congratulations on it once more. So what we'll do is feel free, guys, to ask questions, write them up in the chat box. We're going to read them at the end, and we're going to try to direct them to some of the presenters that we have got today, and we'll also try to combine them into some sort of a meaningful session and a summary right at the end. So thanks very much, Rod. Now we've got Professor Kate Oldie. And when I actually ask people to provide a sentence or two about them, I have to admit Kate has actually provided one that really brought a smile to my face, and I was trying to figure it out how to actually decipher it, but it's listed as a lawyer committed to not being a lawyer, interested in First Nation aspirations, community development, and the environment. And I'll pass it over to you, Kate, so the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Nanad. Thank you. And thanks, Rob, for bringing us all together. This is a really important conversation. I'm in Taungurung country, so I'm actually down in a little town called Euroa, which is on the Hume Highway. I've come away from the Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment in what I call the real camp, which is what many of you here today are representing. Can I just say about what I did there and what I think is really critical about what Rod just said is that it is all about networks and it's about communication. So if you haven't had a look at the new Commissioner's work in that particular office, please go and have a look at the Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment's sites, socials and reports. Rod was asking me to talk about creativity and community, about people, environment and community. And I thought it might be interesting to share this, that while I'm in a little town called Euroa with a population of 3,500, it's just like towns like Canberra and it's just like towns like Melbourne. And we like to think of Paris as being a suburb of this town when we headed off there for the COP all those years ago. What I want to say about connectivity and about where we've landed, Rod, is this, that coming away from Canberra, I came back to a community that had set up an environment series in 2015 and 2016, was thinking about biodiversity and what happens down on the Sevens Creek and about how we revegetate that and get grants to do it. But we learned a whole lot of things from each other that made us expand our remit and our aspirations for change. And so since coming back here, here's some things that this little community has done, and it will speak to many of you. We established a thing called Euroa Energy, and we got some money out of the state government for a microgrid demonstration initiative, which brings together business and also the community. We also went from there to build up the Strathbogie Voices crew, which now is Strathbogie Inc. And that led to some interesting discussions about local food. And I'll come back to that because we set up another thing called Strathbogie Local. We also set up very recently a thing called Euroa Connect. So there's a lot of organisations, but there's a lot of connectivity between all of the people amongst them. Euroa Connect is a group of people who said that we want to be involved in how infrastructure in a small town like this has to meet our needs for now and into the future. We've got the inland rail coming through. We've got the need for a bridge so that they can bring their double stack freight containers. And we've already got a bridge in this town, and we said we don't want a bigger one. We don't want a monster bridge looming over this town. We want something much better. We want design properly considered. And that meant that we brought together architects, and there's a few in a small town like this, a person who's a logistics manager, a person who heads up an institution for people who are sight impaired, who lives on the wrong side of the tracks, me as a lawyer that doesn't want to be the lawyer, my partner who's a farmer and a member of Farmers for Climate Action, and people who have been teachers, artists and retirees. And they all came together because they all thought about biodiversity, sustainability, but suddenly had to start thinking about infrastructure. And that took us off to the Senate Standing Committee about Transport, where we made a submission, and we've now got some really interesting conversations happening around that. But what I'm saying about what we did was that we brought people together about a range of issues and said, go for it. We used our theory of change, which has been start where you are right now, organise right now, and then show what you did, because demonstration sites allow us to be iterative. Then we thought about what we were actually dealing with here in relation to COVID. We're on the railway line, we've got a very poor service, and many of us live here and think about wanting to work in other places. That being the case, we had a farmers market that usually delivered to us local produce, but it had to close because of COVID. We learned how to make sure that we could deliver those particular goods to the community through new digital means. And we have this thing now called Strathbogie Local, which continues to expand and expand and expand. And we deliver the food to people who order it by digital means through the Open Food Network, which is just up the road from us in Violet Town. And people collect their food from, you'd be surprised to hear this, a logistics firm. And ironically, that was the best place to do it because that means we don't have to get any planning permissions. What I'm talking about is a bunch of people who came together around a range of things and said, we can do this. We started many years ago with biodiversity because we got a block of land from the Vic roads as they put the freeway past this town. They had some land left over, which was essentially a gravel pit. That is now the Euroa Arboretum. And if you're ever past here, please call in. The Euroa Arboretum takes us right back to where food started in this particular country and brings us to consideration of how Aboriginal people's understanding of food and sustainability can inform all of us. And we run a number of things out of that particular arboretum to encourage people to understand that, to educate children and adults. And those particular education efforts range from knowing about food, bush tucker in particular, to what we want to think about getting rid of blackberries on creeks, which then exposes sites where Aboriginal people lived, worked and engaged in ceremony, and brings to the fore stone tools which have been brought by people to exhibitions and then taken away with better knowledge. Ultimately, I'm going to finish by saying we can all help each other know better. And in a little community like Euroa, we do exactly that. And we know it's about science communication, but it's about a great deal more. We know it's about open food networks, but it's about a great deal more. And it's always about recognising that everybody has a contribution to make and diversity makes us strong. I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to it.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Kate. That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, as Kate said, we're going to have a question session open up at the end of the talks. The next presenter is Bethany Turner. Bethany Turner is an associate professor in the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at University of Canberra. Her work explores the relationship between people, place, and the environment, concentrating on how best to build the resilience and the capacity of communities to enact more sustainable future in a time of climate change. So, Bethany, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I much prefer Kate's description of herself, so I might have to rework mine. Thanks for letting me be here today with such an amazingly distinguished cast of presenters. I'm also on Ngunnawal country and want to extend my acknowledgement to the Ngunnawal people for caring for country and allowing us to continue to meet here today. I've had the great privilege of working in a number of different ways within Canberra and the surrounding region over the last decade on food-related issues, looking at local means of production in places such as community gardens, how people access local foods through farmers markets, and how households and communities generate and manage food waste. The ingenuity, creativity, and boldness to give something a go that I've seen in all of these sites never ceases to amaze me and inspire me. These are qualities shared by all of those featured in Rod's books, including those of you who are here today. And these are people who contribute to making other worlds possible for us all. And we all, of course, have our part to play. What I've learnt during my research is that there's great potential for us all to learn from the tinkering, trial and error, and experimentation going on in small-scale community spaces all around us. Learnings here, often occurring outside of the mainstream economic system, can strengthen our capacity for adaptation and resilience in the face of a changing climate. Today, I'd like to draw attention to just some of the work that we're doing in the Future of Food Research Group that aims to make some of these small-scale, quiet learnings visible, to test and to probe them and work towards sharing those that are generative and practical within the broader community. Learning from community members from diverse socio-cultural backgrounds is a key focus for many of us and for all of us here, I'm sure. Importantly, this includes First Nations Australians and migrants and refugees, which I'm going to focus on today. Resettlement in a new country involves ongoing adjustments to new social, ecological, and climatic conditions, which can be extremely confronting. When we spoke to refugees from Myanmar in Canberra who had recently accessed shared garden plots, they lamented not being able to buy culturally familiar foods, not being able to access seeds of familiar plants, the length of time it took for things to germinate in frosty weather, and numerous crop failures. But they were determined, despite all of these setbacks and all of these confrontations, to continue to experiment, adapt, and learn on their plots, sharing their knowledge with each other and from those from all backgrounds that gardened nearby. The experimentation of migrants and refugees in backyards, community gardens, and on farms around the world has been shown to boost biodiversity and expand sustainable plant-based diets. The desire to grow culturally relevant foods often involves tinkering with soil and growing conditions, as well as the plants themselves. This is a quiet but deliberate science intimately tied to culture. Adaptations can take years, but local, national, and global examples show us how these actions can help secure our shared local food futures. These efforts include developing hybrids adapted to new climate zones, such as those I know who've managed to grow tropical fruits in Canberra through years of trial and error, developing new grafting techniques. It also includes sharing knowledge and expertise about low water consumption plants and how to modify the ways in which we might cultivate, and modes of caring for soil that increase fertility. Bringing together culturally diverse community members can foster more meaningful social connections, but there is also a growing body of evidence that indicates it will strengthen our shared ability to adapt to the uncertainty of a changing climate, providing us with vital scientific insight and health benefits. But these actions need to be visible and shared. And to do this, we need investment in accessible community gardening and urban agricultural initiatives that make this possible for our socially and culturally diverse communities so that we can all learn together. And that's the story that I wanted to share today. Thanks, Nanad.
Thanks very much, Bethany. Yeah, you have basically captured quite a lot of information in 3 minutes, and well done. As I said to everyone else, we just have got another couple of people joining us. Feel free to type in your questions as the speakers are presenting. and we'll read them out at the end of the session. The next presenter that we have got is Susan Jeans. Susan has several decades of experience in the politics and the politics of energy, being a former member of the Howard government and a director, chair, or CEO of a number of organizations focused on growing the supply of renewable energy in Australia, or otherwise reducing emissions from the energy sector. These include ARENA, the Climate Institute, and the advisory board to the Centre for Energy Technology at the University of Adelaide. She's currently a director at the Jeans Holland and Associates and the chair-elect of the newly established Heavy Industry Low Emission Transition CR.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I gave you far too much information, I think. Look, Rod asked me to speak about leadership, so I thought about it, and I thought, what were the three major ingredients that that I think leadership is about? So if you can go to the next screen, thanks, Nina. My view, this is my view entirely. It's no complete analysis or no analysis that can really be held up. It's just what I think after a long time in and around politics. And I suppose I observe that, you know, one of the major problems of the political system that we have is how you have integrity to your beliefs when you are so often rewarded for not having them. And empathy is a really important ingredient, because if you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you can't make decisions on their behalf. But doing something interesting and right, I've always thought it was really important that people do something interesting, that they do what where their interests take them. And so far, the people that we've had talking this afternoon have clearly done that. But how do you actually assess what is right? Because a leader does something interesting that you want to be interested in, and they need to be able to do things that are right. So next screen, thanks, Nina. So I didn't want to put assessment tools because I thought that was a bit rude, but I really thought about some of our recent political leaders and how they've performed against the criteria that I think are important. Clearly, against any worthy criteria, in my view, Trump failed. Howard, I think, was somebody who always remained true to his beliefs, and whether you agreed with them or not, I thought that was an important quality, and I was in Parliament under Howard. And I felt the same thing about Rudd. I think he is somebody who always pursued what he thought right. We might not agree with him, but he was clear on doing that. The saddest part for me about the first woman Prime Minister in Australia was that in order to get there and stay there, she wasn't as believable as she needed to be, because she was clearly compromising, in my view, her beliefs in order to maintain the leadership of the Labor Party. And sadly, I felt the same thing about Malcolm Turnbull, who probably was my favourite out of all of them. I'm a fan of Turnbull's belief systems. Next slide, thanks. And again, I wanted to score them against empathy. And again, Trump clearly failed. Howard, again, if you knew Howard well, and I don't believe that people always perceive this about Howard, he really did have empathy with people, and he really did care about the people he was making policies for. I think Rudd had a little less of this. I didn't know how to score him, so I gave him a 50-50. Gillard, I think, is someone who had an enormous amount of empathy for people. And Turnbull, again, didn't know how to score him, so I scored him 50-50. Next slide, thanks. So I look at everything through a social liberal lens. I think liberalism is kind of my form of religion. And I think that tension in liberalism, where you want individuals to be able to flourish and reach their full potential, but at the same time, you have to limit their capacity, because you don't want people doing harm to others whilst they're in the process of reaching their own full potential. And that's a really good tension that is a really good tool for policymakers, but they don't necessarily understand it or use it. So I wanted to have, when I think about right, and if you go to the next slide, thanks. When I think about right, I think about that challenge. Are people doing the right thing by that challenge? And Trump clearly, again, never. Howard, I think, tried to, but his own conservatism often pulled him back. Rudd, again, I think people would have very different views on how Rudd performed. I think you either loved him and believed in his interestingness and his rightfulness, or you didn't. And I thought the same about Gillard and Turnbull. So on my scoring system, Trump is clearly the loser. Howard is probably the winner, and yet he's probably the person that I least agreed with in terms of what his policy program. I think Gillard comes next, and then sadly for me, Turnbull comes last. So I wanted to use this to illustrate that you don't actually have to have good ideas, but you have to have a mix of qualities in order to be a good leader. And I've just presented you with my favourite three. If we go to the last slide, thanks. So again, you cannot be a leader of any sort without integrity to your own ideas. People can see through that. Well, we hope people can see through that. You can't be a leader without empathy because you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes and you can't make decisions on their behalf. And the difference between interesting and right, it shouldn't be subjective, but it is. And that's one of the problems with living in a democracy. You need an educated citizen and an educated polity to realise, to understand what a good leader is. And it takes a lot of effort to read through the way in which you are delivered news, whether it be electronic or print. You need to know where that information is coming from to be able to wade your way through it. And I think Trump is the best illustration of a bad media and a poorly educated part of the country. Again, just my view, but these are my observations. It takes a good leader to do the right thing for all of the people that they're leading, and they're not easy to find. So they're my views on leadership, Rod. I hope that was okay.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was definitely a very interesting presentation and a very brief summary of some of the leaders. Thanks very much for that. The next person that we have got presenting is Monica Oliphant. And Monica Oliphant worked 18 years for electricity utility ETSA as a research scientist prior to privatization. She was a president of the International Solar Energy Society in 2008-2009, and currently is on the International Renewable Energy Agency Coalition for Action Steering Committee. Monica received an AO in 2015, was 2016 Senior South Australian of the Year, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of South Australia in 2018. She's a passionate renewable energy advocate.
Thank you very much. I thought you might rather look at a picture rather than at me. And thank you for your invitation to talk, and especially thanks to Rod for writing such a passionate book about people with environmental passions. I'm honoured to be among them. Today I'm on Ghana country. I've been involved with renewable energy for over 40 years, and I'll be talking on the changes I've experienced and how we're going. When I started in the early 1970s, the environmental movement and renewables were only in their infancy. Solar was mainly for water heating, wind for water pumping on farms and producing small amounts of off-grid electricity, and PV was for powering satellites. By the late 1980s, I'd been working for the electricity utility ETSA for a number of years and been involved in a 30-site survey of the wind resource in South Australia. Not that ETSA thought it would ever be cost-effective to use wind instead of coal and gas. However, this wind survey meant that by the early 2000s, when the mandatory renewable energy target, MREC, came into effect, South Australia was in a good position to benefit from federal subsidy. MREC also brought in widespread first incentives in Australia for PV, and Susan Jeans and I played a very small part in this. Interestingly, the introduction of MREC was through a fortuitous mistake. John Howard wished to get the GST through Parliament. The Democrats' leader, Meg Lees, was horse trading, wanting to establish a greenhouse gas abatement program. Former Treasurer Mr. Costello recollected in 2011. This was 1999. Neither Howard nor I had much of an idea of what a greenhouse gas was, let alone how to abate it. Trying to cooperate without blowing the financial position I whispered to Hal, offer her 400. Okay, he said, 400 million. She accepted. I, Costello, tapped him on the shoulder and whispered in his ear, that's not what I meant. I meant we should offer her 400,000. There's no way to retract the offer. Incentives for renewable energy in Australia were born. The feed-in tariff, initiated in 2008, really was driving force for rapid growth in PV in Australia. A combination of high electricity prices and community embracing technology means we now have in Australia the highest watts per capita penetration of PV in the world. And over 25% of Australian homes have rooftop solar, and almost 40% of homes in Queensland and South Australia, and growing. Renewable electricity penetration in Australia currently averages almost 30%, but varies greatly by state, with the top two largest locally generated penetrations being in Tasmania, with almost 100%, mainly from hydro, and South Australia, with 60% of electricity from solar and wind, the second highest variable renewable energy grid penetration in the world, with 100% planned for 2030, but likely to get there several years early, and with 500% renewable electricity, a target for 2050. All states and territories have a net zero emissions target by 2050. Only the federal government has no targets yet. It is important to note that just 32% of Australia's emissions come from the electricity sector. The remaining 68% come from fossil fuel use in residential, commercial and industrial heating, transport, industrial processes, etc. And there is currently no renewables use, hardly at all, in these sectors. And may I have the next slide, please? And I leave you with these two graphs that really depress me. The left-hand side is overall primary energy consumption change in Australia over 10 years, and the right-hand side is the global change. The drop in fossil fuel use and increase in renewables over 10 years is almost negligible. A more rapid transition to renewable electrification, primary energy and the primary energy, and the production of green hydrogen in all sectors is urgently needed. And thank you, and sorry for a quick rush through. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Monica. That was absolutely great presentation, and I have to admit it's sometimes very scary to look at those numbers that you have presented, and definitely we should be moving more towards and faster towards the utilization of these type of energy sources. The last person that we have got to present today, but not the least, is Professor Sean Somerset. Sean is a professor of public health and a professor of nutrition and dietetics in the Faculty of Health at University of Canberra. His general field of interest relates to environmental aspects of food choice, the various controls, barriers, and facilitators involved, and how the expanding world population will ensure food security into the future. Answers to these issues span in a range of research contexts, from community-based school and urban gardens initiatives through to the population-based studies on determinants of food consumption. And I'll pass it over to you, Sean.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks very much for the introduction, Ahmed, and thank you to the previous speakers. We've covered a wide range of issues this afternoon already. I'll bring it back to food this time, but I'm certainly looking forward to Nanad's bringing together of all these different presentations into some bigger picture. So what I wanted to do this afternoon was just share with you a case study. I've been, for a long period of time, interested in the application of school gardens in nutrition education. And so this is a case study that started maybe 20 years ago or so. And it started, I was in charge of the placements for student dietitians at Griffith University. And we were having trouble finding community nutrition programs to embed them in. And so I had been working with a food activist, Dick Copeman, up in Brisbane, which is where I'm broadcasting from today. And he was very heavily involved in a local community garden. And so I just put this photograph in. It's a bit fuzzy and a bit old these days, but what really fascinated me by the position of Northey Street City Farm in the middle of Brisbane was that you can see in the foreground part of the community garden, but in the background you can see the largest hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. And I thought that was a really interesting juxtapositioning between health and disease in the background. It certainly worked for me and pushed me along. Now, there was a little bit of resistance from the student dietitians who had planned to be working in the hospital in the background when I said, well, your next placement is going to be in a community garden. But I can tell you the turnaround in attitudes was actually quite phenomenal. Once they realized what community gardens are all about, they realized the very strong connections between food, nutrition, and health, and also community within the community garden. And as I delved into this further, I realized that there was quite a deal of evidence to support the role of community gardens in health. And one of the things that I noticed with the community garden was that there were a lot of schools that did little field trips to the garden, and they were doing all sorts of activities, and the engagement with the children was actually quite phenomenal. And I thought to myself, well, this will be very interesting to actually see if this sort of technology, we can call it, the idea of community garden, can be applied to nutrition education of children. And so what I did was I mapped out, now this is not as elaborate as Rod's diagram of how he formulated his book, but I mapped out the stakeholders that might be involved in the promotion of school gardens. And what I found was I was at Education Queensland, so the state education department. I was speaking to one of their senior policy advisors, and he told me point blank that Education Queensland does not support the gardens in schools because they're just used as a punishment. So the kids misbehaving, they get sent out the garden to cool down, and then they come back into the classroom. Bear in mind, this was 20 years ago. It was going a long way. So I thought, well, this was not my experience. This was not my observation. Was I missing something? And I realized that there was no literature out there to actually substantiate the use of school gardens as an education tool. I had another interest, of course. These are my two young daughters here who actually had quite a vibrant school garden at where they were studying as primary school students. So the first thing we did was to look at how school gardens are actually used. And so there was emerging evidence that, in fact, the gardens were being incorporated without curriculum, I might add, were being incorporated into education programs across the state, as I realized with a subsequent study looking at the prevalence of school gardens and how they were actually used across the state. So this was a study emerging in 2009. You can see here that without any sort of organization from central government agency, that it was actually reasonably prevalent that school gardens were something that were developed by the community, for the community, and were being used in schools. Now, I was doing this work in Australia, but coincidentally, there was other colleagues of mine who were doing work internationally. And from that point, with a few other studies, I was able to link internationally with like-minded academics to basically, now, again, you don't need to read the details of this, but we established how school gardens might be integrated into the running of schools and contribute to education outcomes, but more broadly to community development. And we also worked out where the evidence was and where the gaps in the evidence was to come to this sort of concept map, which has been quite readily cited throughout the international literature now. So my colleagues, I should acknowledge Jamie Davis from the University of Texas in Austin, who's a major collaborator here. But another point that I want to make about when we do research at universities, there's something called the research teaching nexus, where the objective there is to take the research that we read and the research that we do and integrate it into our education program. So you can see here at the bottom here, I've got this point, building competencies for graduates, so that when graduates leave our programs, they actually take some of our research and our observations with them to become the nutritionists, the agents of change in the future. So it's a short, it's compressed. This is a 20-year story, but it originated from basically acknowledging that the community actually is the repository of quite an extensive range of knowledge and know-how in particular areas. That's the first thing. There's a lot of knowledge out there, and universities can be a major partner in bringing forth that knowledge to a wider audience. Number two, I also came across a lot of mythology, and so it's important also to identify ideas that are not strictly true and make sure that that is also shared. Often the decision makers in the public sector have misconceptions which need to be corrected or at least workshopped and processed through. And my final observation, conclusion with this particular case study, which I think is relevant to our discussions this afternoon, is that productive community, public sector, university collaborations really are important to build community capacity, which is my experience, my observation, and I really think it's quite an important aspect that we can share our knowledge and move forward. So essentially, very short, very sharp, but that is my take on this particular topic. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Sean. That is, and thanks for Paul's challenge of trying to bring all this together under a summary. And just while you were presenting and while you were talking, I was actually thinking of how am I actually going to compile all this and bring it together for the audience. And I came up with two ways. And the first one is a personal observation and from a personal perspective. And the second one is from the more academic approach. The personal perspective is that all these stories that I have heard today actually resonate quite well with me, because I arrived back when during the Keating government. So I arrived to Australia as a refugee from the former war-torn country of Yugoslavia. And everything that has been said so far, whether that has been from the political perspective or whether that has been from environmental or leadership, sustainability perspective, food aspects have kind of been combined together. And I remember arriving to Australia as a fresh migrant. As I said, and I was staying in the city of Newcastle. That was my first landing point in Australia. And I was with my dad. We walked outside into the front yard of the one-bedroom unit where four of us stayed, and we looked at a road across, and it was just a field called the Denga Park, or as the people that lived in the Mayfield used to call it, a danger park, due to the various activities that were occurring there. But my father and I were standing there just in front of the house and looking at the Denga Park, and there was a whole flock of ducks. It was absolutely unbelievable. There was about 50 ducks around. And the first thought that we both had, and when we looked at each other, we both looked at each other and we said, I said to my dad, you know what, in this country, we were never going to be hungry. And I guess there is so much of the resources in Australia, and there's so many of the available food sources that sometimes we really don't think about what happens if that actually disappears. And nowadays, more than ever, we are actually faced with this, not only with a pandemic that everybody obviously is aware of, but we're also faced with a depletion of those sources, whether those sources are from energy perspective, whether they're sources from the utilization of the renewable energy sources, or we are facing the importance of having the food challenges being posed in front of us. And how do we actually combine all these? it is a combination of a number of different factors. It is a combination of government initiatives. It's a combination of people themselves, academics, and obviously the industry. So all of us, sorry, in the summary, somewhat we really have to not only play our own part, but also not pass on the information to us, this is not my job and somebody else has to do it. And in saying that, I have already taken up some of my time in trying to finalize all this. It brings us to that a great word of the multidisciplinary approach. And how do we approach this? And there is no other way than actually having a truly multidisciplinary approach to solve these type of problems. Rod has obviously brought a number of different people in his book, and he has combined and provided a very good synergy of different sources of information, but also synergy of different personal stories that actually bring this book together. And combine them all together, it also provides probably a pathway of where to and how to from now on. And each one of us obviously can take that at a different level and a different perspective. So I hope that I will finish this as my summary of this event, but I hope that this has actually provided some sort of a clarity as to how do we combine all these things together and push forward. We do have a couple of the questions and some of the comments, and I actually do have a question, particularly towards maybe, I'll leave it open to everyone. So if presenters, please, if you don't mind, turn your videos on and feel free to turn your mics on, unmute yourself a microphone whenever the time comes up. I guess my main question would be, why do we need to address these issues from a multidisciplinary perspective? And I guess I have answered it somewhat, but when we talk about a multidisciplinary perspective, me, myself, as a scientist, I always think about if I don't have in my team, in my research team, if I don't have a biochemist, I'm always trying to look for a biochemist. If I don't have a psychologist, I'm looking for a psychologist. But obviously, this is a hell of a lot more complex issue that we are discussing. So what is your take on the multidisciplinarity aspect of the issue that we are dealing with? So I'll leave it up to you, panelists. So whoever wants to take it first.
Do you want me to chip in now and then, Ed?
Rod, go for it.
Okay, well, my background, apart from media, is systems. And in systems, we are accustomed to taking all the facets of a problem and put them together. Now, a lot of what you do in IT is technical stuff. And it really struck me, I did my degree at the University of Canberra. Actually, it was called the CCAE back in those days. And I spent 90% of my time doing technical stuff, how to design a database, how to write code, how to design a system. But when I got into the workplace, it was 90% of my time was dealing with people and 10% of my time was doing technical things. So we don't have a problem with the science, a lack of the science. We have a people problem. But I've seen so many systems. I've never seen a system fail for technical reasons. I've always seen it fail because of people reasons. And that's an example of when if you don't think about a thing as a system, bringing multiple facets together, or you would call that multidisciplinary, then you're not going to succeed.
Thanks, Rod. Anybody else would like to take on?
Nanette, it's Kate here. I wonder if I could answer a question that's been raised by Ro. Do you really want us to?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. I was
about
to read it out. So go for it, Kate.
Yeah. Ro, look, you asked how can universities better serve communities and how can we engage in information sharing with communities? I just think there's no better way than just doing it. And I must say that one of the strengths of every university that ultimately will produce better graduates is that they are talking to their communities about what they need and where they are. And I think COVID's actually created a real test for us all all in that regard because we think we can do everything digitally and we probably can't. So universities need to be out there. They need to encourage their researchers, their staff, their teachers, their students to be part of the communities that they are immersed in, and they need to engage much better than they probably do. What I would say about that is I think it helps regional universities. I think it helps to have students who are in small country towns or in towns like Shepparton. I think it helps to make sure that universities are seen, because one of the things that has to happen is when we want to get to change, we need good demonstration sites. Probably doesn't answer the depth of your question because you want to talk about social science and how it's done, but I think those are really critical things to be taking on board.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thank you for that. And I actually got sidetracked and I was choking. So thanks very much for taking and answering that question. We do have a question here. It seems more of a comment as well from you, Kate, to Sean. And it says, Sean, seems to us in our community that when exposed to ideas, curious people warm to them, and the children are always among the most curious. School guidance as a punishment seems arcane. What a strange historical view. Do you have any comments on that, Sean?
Thanks, Nadia. Look, I did respond to Kate in the text box. So that's what really caught me off guard, because I wasn't expecting that sort of reference from a senior policy advisor. Admittedly, it was 20 years ago, and I think part of the explanation is, to the untrained eye, community gardens look pretty messy, and so I think that's quite confronting for somebody who comes from a sort of a mainstream background. But it didn't take long for the tides to turn, I have to say. I mean, it took maybe 10 years at most for all of a sudden this wave of enthusiasm for school gardens emerged, to the point where there was an attempt by some Melbourne yuppies to corporatize and globalize the concept in the kitchen garden concept, which I think defeats the purpose anyway. But yeah, look, I think that's what really sort of motivated me to get something done about it, because it just didn't make sense to me that was the mindset.
Sean, can I say, my husband was probably one of those kids that was kicked out and had to tend the school garden. And I'm really glad that he did, because as Monica and Rod will attest to, I live with an organic vegetable producer, a prolific organic vegetable producer, and I get my tomato sauces and my year's worth of tomatoes and fresh everything, or a bit of a downturn in the last 6 months. We're still establishing a new garden at a new house. But I'm really glad that he got kicked out. Anyway, I just wanted to say about the initial start of this the question period. We were talking about people, the benefits of interdisciplinary work, and there's two things sprung to mind there. One was at the University of Adelaide, we have a Centre for Energy Technology, and it incorporates every discipline within the engineering and the environment and the sciences, with chemists, physicists, everybody trying to work out how to solve problems, because there's obvious realisation that you can't solve problems on your own. And that further reminds me of, I used to run a geothermal energy association, and the geologists used to say, oh, this stuff about climate change is rubbish. Temperature's changed, temperature of the earth has changed, swung back and forward over the lifetime of the planet. We can read it in the rocks, but it goes back to that you actually want an expert in the field, and I'm very interested in the personality flaws or the knowledge flaws of people who think they know everything. And I suppose there's plenty of us out there. But that's why if you can't work with others, then you're not going to go very far in exploring really interesting questions.
I'd like to also answer the question about universities and the sustainability transition. I've been interested that during the pandemic, the government seems to be taking notice of the scientists but I don't understand why they don't take any notice of scientists in regard to climate change. And it is an interesting thing that is happening. What I've also been happy with in South Australia is that the two political parties are pretty well on track in trying to promote renewable energy. I had run outside and given my dogs biscuits to try and stop them barking, and they finished the biscuits, and the people, there's somebody going outside. Sorry about that. I might not, it is from the people upwards that is certainly helping in the transition, and they're taking notice of the scientists much more than the politicians, and I'll leave it there.
No problem at all. Thanks very much, Monica. It is really actually funny that as soon as we are trying to organize anything to be recorded, we all have a dogs in the background barking, or there's an angle grinder, or somebody's trying to use a whippersnapper. So no, that is absolutely fine. We do have a question from the audience, and I guess this is more related to the curriculum change. Is there a potential for a curriculum change to encourage community gardens in school? So I will leave it probably to Sean.
Okay, thanks, Britt. Little by little, there's been change, and again, that systematic review that I showed, the final study I showed, was actually a potential framework whereby schools could start to base their curricula around having a school garden. But the other thing I want to point out is that in that mapping exercise across parts of Queensland, it showed that, school gardens don't work for every school. And what I think about school gardens is that those ones that emerged just out of the community, emerged out of community need, community desire to have, and I'm talking about the school community, to have a school garden. But other schools come up with different solutions to what they need in terms of those education resources they have. So I don't think it's for every school, but certainly that was one of the intentions of our work, to actually provide some sort of guidance for schools to base curricula on.
Can I pick up on something that Monica said? And this is really maybe a question for Susan with a political background. But I always remember interviewing Brian Schmidt, and after the interview, we were talking about climate change, and he said, "Why the politicians don't listen to the science," and I got quite impassioned. And they don't play by the same rules. There's political thinking and there's scientific thinking, and they're very different motivations. And how many people in Parliament have scientific training? Almost entirely lawyers, or not that I have a thing against lawyers, but it's horribly unbalanced. So to Monica and Susan, do you want to pick up on that theme?
Well, some of that, it's surprising when you actually go to the APH website and read some of the CVs or the histories of people who do go into Parliament. Some of them are really interesting, and some of them you wonder why they're wasting their time in politics, because they seem to have been making a much better contribution in a much more meaningful way before they did it. A lot of people go into politics thinking that they will solve the problems of the world, and when you get there you find out it's a lot harder than you ever expected. But I don't think, I think there's a lot of people who make, a lot of the independents, I suppose, the cowboys, who make their name on denying climate change exists. And I don't think it's that they don't hear it. They don't want to hear it. And I think that they're serving a very sort of limited right-wing constituency who doesn't want to hear that their life is going to get more complicated. There's this left-wing conspiracy, and I think that's probably one of the big problems with the way climate change was initially raised. It seemed to come from the Greens, and therefore it must be bad. And I think that remains a huge barrier to particularly coalition governments in addressing what scientists are telling them. And Monica rightly pointed out, here in South Australia, we're really lucky. We've got a social liberal premier, and we've got a really nice guy for a energy minister who has not sacked anybody from in his department, who worked for the previous government, who has just rolled on with the program that the previous government had for energy and climate change. And so I think we're a nice little social experiment here that you don't really see anywhere else in the country.
And I agree with that. And I'll just add a little bit about politics and probably jobs and the just transition out of fossil fuels into renewables. There's such a lot of talk that people are going to lose their jobs, livelihood, money. But there's a lot of information coming out that in a just transition, you can go to jobs in producing hydrogen, electric vehicles, and there are a lot more jobs in the offing going to a carbon-free future than probably is from fossil fuels, which jobs are going to decrease naturally due to exports not going forward or decreasing. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I make a comment, Ned? It takes us back to one of the questions asked earlier about, is there a curriculum change to encourage community gardens in schools? And I just want to say that that question speaks to everything we've talked about. And the answer to it is, don't wait. When we've seen community gardens established in some Victorian schools, it's been because a school council said they needed it. And they said to the grandparents, would you like to come along? And Nonna, would you like to be part of what we're doing here? And suddenly an intergenerational response to the need for creating or producing our own food in a small, a microcosm of the community, I suppose. So my point would be, don't wait. And I think what we've seen here in this little town of Euroa is a community of people, and there's a bunch of people who are, of course, always involved in these things. That's probably the nature of the beast. But we've seen a community of people who started with biodiversity and restoring a creek, and who now understand that the issues of renewable energy and microgrids and business and community being involved in it is the same sort of question. It's the same sort of question that involves the same sort of people saying, we're not waiting. It goes to the point, Monica, that you made, that you feel frustrated it's taken so long to get to where we've got to. But every time we crank the handle, we get a bit further down the road, and it's happening quicker than some of us thought it would, because people haven't waited. And it goes to Charlie Prell and the Farmers for Climate Action. People said, we're not waiting, we're just getting on with it. So I think we worry about the paralysis at the political level. And South Australia, you're very lucky. New South Wales is also very lucky with the terrific Environment Minister who really challenges things. Victoria's lucky about the way in which we're thinking about energy. And sometimes the way we get people to these necessary changes is by saying there are co-benefits here, and it might be as simple as getting the grandparents to come along and help with the community garden.
Thanks so much for that, Kate. And I've got one comment, and I actually have got a question as well. And a comment is that the colleagues that know me, I always try to stay away from the politics, and I'm really bad with the involvement of the politics, probably because of my past and coming from the socialistic country where there was only a party in a government, and coming to Australia, there's a number of different parties and different views. And what I find it really interesting is that from every party perspective that is in a power, there is one agenda that has been always pushed. While we are finding it surprising that politicians are involved with the funds, and we're finding it surprising that politicians are. There was a couple of comments, even a comment from a Charlie. The reason that the politicians don't listen to the science about the climate change is totally due to the power, influence, and wealth of the fossil fuel companies globally, and most particularly in Australia. And when you talk that to the community, the people seem to be surprised that that is actually the case. Well, it is the case right around the world. It doesn't matter of the hierarchical structure, but it's a socialistic or a capitalistic way of the country. It's still that power that actually brings a lot of influence. And again, this is just my opinion. I've got a question actually for Bethany, in particular regards the refugees that are coming into the country, and how do they actually adapt to the community gardens? I mean, as I said, I'm you know, a 30-year now of a refugee, still calling myself a refugee. But coming into the country as a city boy, that the only thing that I could grow was a concrete. The community gardens, do they actually encompass the refugees as a place of joining together, as a place of similarities, and rather than just looking at it from the food growth perspective? So would you be able to comment on that, Bethany?
Sure, and I think absolutely it's important to point out that people are coming from different backgrounds, and therefore the use of these spaces is going to be varied depending on those backgrounds. Increasingly, people coming to Australia are coming from areas where they have had some connection to food growing previously, and there's a desire to reconnect with that. So in these spaces, they're usually developed based around people's desire to grow food at the same time as they're about providing a connection to community. So I think it's the same that we've all been talking about. This where it works well is when people express this desire to do it, and they want space, and then a community group is able to help facilitate that to occur. Unfortunately, you know, we're dealing with you know, very vulnerable groups quite often that don't necessarily have access to the means to just get some land or to create that action. And so there's a need to make connections out into the community more broadly to support that. So I think it can achieve a lot of aims, but it does depend on the particular groups, and it does need to be driven and managed and by members of these groups. It can't just be created for them, and then, you know, it has to actually be a sharing of learnings and incorporating their needs and meeting their needs into these processes. But the process of adaptation is incredibly difficult and challenging, as you have experienced, and gardens have been shown repeatedly to provide spaces for some people to actually ease those transitions. They can be therapeutic spaces, but they actually are practical spaces where the actual adjustment to ecological conditions is occurring, and a sense of ecological belonging can be forged in new lands in ways that are going to enable us potentially to grow foods that we're not used to in these spaces, that are actually more suited to the changing climate and those sorts of things as well.
Great, thanks very much for that, Bethany. And I'm just going to try to wrap this up and ask for any of the final comments from our panelists, or any of the final questions to anyone. And there is a question that just basically came in from Anne, and it says, I'm thinking about a way in which academic and science-based and Western knowledges are privileged over more grassroots and environmental kinds of knowledge, as well as Indigenous way of knowing and being connected. Any further thoughts on this? I'll throw the ball over to Kate.
Thanks very much, Nenad. What we've found here in Northeast Victoria is that if we reach out to the Aboriginal communities who are themselves looking for ways to regain land or recreate themselves as contemporary users of land that they've not had access to, that we've been bringing them into things like the Euroa Arboretum. If you've got a venue, then invite people in. And I go back to that point, don't wait, because if you do wait for Aboriginal people to extend the hand, sometimes it won't happen because they are busy, and they often think that if there isn't an invitation, then people aren't interested. We've found that making the invitation is the first place to begin. And it extends to things that you really don't find out of left field. For instance, the Taungurung people here have art galleries up in the Strathbogie Ranges that have been recognised. Now, that's what you would regard as contemporary cultural recognition. They've then gone and put together their own dictionary, and we've now shared that with our council. And in sharing it with our council, it's coming through in ways in which we might think about naming streets, and that then encourages people to understand that they are back with a vengeance, or with force and strength. And there's lots of ways to do it, but it's about relationships, and Aboriginal people will tell you that, and they'll say, don't wait, talk to us.
Great, thanks very much for that, Kate. Anyone else wants to join in?
I think my closing thought along the lines of what I said earlier, and that is that this is not a problem we can solve on our own. That one of the reasons why humans are the most successful, arguably the most successful species on the planet, is our ability to cooperate. And that's what we're going to need if we're going to get anywhere. If we're going to solve the problems of the world, we need to work with each other, and we need to get over the idea that, you know, I'm that great, and Kate and and Susan and Monica and Sean and yourselves each have given examples of how amazing things happen when people work together. And if you've ever worked in a really good team, and I know, actually I should say, having worked with you at the University of Canberra to get this event going, we put a lot of work into it, but to see how everybody chipped in and we're part of that, it's a wonderful thing to see. And I'm very lucky and I'm very thankful for being able to do that.
Thanks very much, Rod. Susan, any thoughts, comments?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you to the university for putting this event on. I think Rod is very passionate about the things that he writes about, and the other things that he does outside of writing our particular book, and the one in which the Fragilians are examined. We need a lot more of these sorts of conversations. I think it so often seems to be common sense, the things that we've been talking about this afternoon, but that doesn't necessarily mean common sense rises without people continually pushing the message and demonstrating that things are as they should be.
Thank you. I'll pass it over to you, Sean.
Do you want me to wind it up, Nanette? Is that the story?
Just the final comments, and I'll wind it up.
Okay, radio. Well, there's a couple of notes that I made that I'd like to pursue further. Firstly, I've always found it intriguing how consensus forms within populations, and you know there seems to be resistance, and then all of a sudden, public opinion turns, it seems, on a sixpence. And I would really like to explore that in some way further. I mean, it's not in my area of expertise, but it's certainly something I observe in food policy or policy related to public health. The other idea that I had jotted down here was this idea of evidence. So Kate was mentioning that she was a lawyer trying not to be a lawyer. But it seems to me, with my observation of this, that if you talk to a lawyer about evidence, it's a very different animal to when us scientists talk about evidence. And I think that there's something very interesting to be explored there as well. Again, I'm not a political scientist, but I'd certainly like to sort of explore that idea a little bit further, because I think that's part of, that's at the crux of what we're talking about, that the politicians seem to cherry pick evidence to support their own political agenda, whereas in the science side of things, we're more trying to have a look at all evidence to see where the truth might lie. Anyway, those are a couple of ideas, and just to reiterate what Rod was alluding to before, that a lot of these challenges are very complex, and clearly the answers are not simple, and they require complex responses that invariably involve multidisciplinary approaches and teamwork. And when I say multidisciplinary approaches, I mean it's not just one sector. I mean the community is a fountain of knowledge, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks very much, Sean. Monica?
I would just like to thank Rod for writing the book. It certainly was not a traditional way that you write a book on sustainability. I learned so much about so many different areas that I had never heard of, and I wish I would have put the book in front of me, because some of the areas were just way out on feeding animals from with the worms and so on. It was absolutely interesting. And I'd just like to mention that one of my most outstanding memories of being in the workforce was when I was involved in the solar diesel power station at Wilpena in the Flinders Ranges. And I walked around with an Aboriginal elder trying to find a place where to put it. And he showed me campsites and burial sites and told me how we shouldn't really have it in sight of the highest peak, which would upset the traditional owners. And the way they now give tours on foods that you can find in the bush, it was a wonderful experience, and we can learn from our traditional owners a lot.
Thank you very much, Monica. And Bethany?
Thanks. Yeah, it's been great to be here. Fantastic book. I just would like to finish on the, we're talking about community, and I guess that notion of that we extend community beyond the human to the more than human in our multi-species interaction. So communities are the soil, the bacteria, the trees, everything around us, that we are all, interconnected and entangled. And that's, I think, what drives many of us here. Thanks,
Ned. Thanks very much. Rod, I just want to say overall congratulations on publishing the book. It is definitely an interesting write-up, and it's not only that brings the information about what can we do regards to sustainability and how fragile our planet is, but it also brings the personal aspect from each one of the people that are involved in the individual chapters, which also puts another layer of the real people behind the stories of their struggles and the successes, and aspiration towards the success. So it definitely brings that personality and a personal approach to a number of different things that those individuals that you have combined together in this book actually do and try to bring in. I just want to wrap this up and thank to all of you guys, to Susan, Kate, Sean, Monica, Bethany, Rod, everyone else that has been involved in, and to all of the people that have attended this presentation. And I hope that this is the first one in a line of many that we are trying to do here at the UC, and that we are trying to actually expand not only the contributions from the UC, but also to expand to the general public, to actually see us as we are not just researchers. We are not just we don't just do the rats and stats, as I famously said. We also actually work with the people. We all work with the community. We do listen to the public. We do listen to the politicians. We are trying to provide the latest and probably the most recent evidence to support some of the claims that can resonate not only in the community but also in industry and in the political sides as well. So I just want to say thank you very much, everyone. Thanks very much for attending. I sincerely appreciate it. By all means, if you haven't seen the book, Rod has already posted where you can actually tap into the book and purchase the book. It's definitely worth a read. It's definitely worth having on a bookshelf and going back to it and reading it in times like this. So thanks very much, everyone. This was absolutely fantastic. And I'm just going to give the famous Zoom wave to everyone, and thank you for your participation and your time. Best of luck in the future, and we'll definitely contact you soon. Thanks.